Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
Hope everybody had a great weekend. Susan, how was your weekend?
My weekend was quiet. I actually hid in my house and binge watched a lot of Netflix.
Mm,
And I needed that recharge minute, and I feel like my brain is ready to think again.
good, good, good. I had a great weekend. Visited my daughter in Chicago and looking outside, reminding me of the flight in yesterday, which thankfully the pilots steered us all around all the thunderstorms you guys must have had here. It
Yeah,
was,
the
yeah.
weather's been a little crazy.
So thankful for good pilots. That's what I'm thankful for today.
Yes.
So, so what we realized when we were talking about laying out future podcasts and things we were going to discuss, we realized that we needed to lay some groundwork to make people understand how we got to where we are when we use terminology related to things, what it means. So Susan did a masterful job and knows it like the back of her hand. So it wasn't a tremendous amount of research. She always awes me when she rattles off this law and this statute and why it came to be. But now she's going to share all of her wealth and breadth and depth of knowledge with you guys. So you've got a good playbook for how we got to where we are and how we can make things better going forward related to special education.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Although, um, we only know what we know. And I think that's true for all of us as we start this journey. And even those of us who've been on this journey for a little while, like, a couple of decades at this point, there's still always more to know. And if you're new and your children are little and you're just getting into special education, or you're a new special ed teacher, yay, thank you. We need you. Our kids need you. And the law, I guess the good news is, and sometimes it's the bad news, is the law has been in place as it is, like as it was written, since 2004. Congress has not reauthorized the special education law that's currently in place at the federal level since 2004. And so we've all had, school districts have had a long time to become familiar with what is required of them. And it hasn't really changed. I mean, it's updated, there's been tweaks, but the law itself in this current iteration has been in place for 20 years. And so hopefully that gives, you know, people who have to implement it, they should know what they're doing by now. And um, and sometimes we encounter that, and sometimes we don't. As advocates that work with families, that go into meetings that are under the umbrella of special education, we're sometimes surprised that we sit in rooms with people who are professionals who don't seem to understand what's expected of them by this law that originally was written in 1975. It was last reauthorized in 2004. We've had 20 years for implementation in this current iteration, and yet sometimes we still are having conversations about expectations. Think that's fair, Sue?
Oh, absolutely fair. And we've heard it all from the blame shift of whose responsibility it was, or funding issues, or in, for lack of a better word, excuses of all kinds of reasons why they choose not to do what they should be doing. But we'll back up a little bit. Susan's talking about the federal law, starting with the federal law. Are you going to go through explaining?
I am. I just am trying to say that, although I'm going to get into policy and law and numbers, because I think that people having facts to make decisions is really important. What we do, you and I, as advocates for families that go to schools and sit in meetings for individual children, what we're going to talk about, this federal law, the state laws that fall under it, the local policies that help implement it. Why any of this matters is because it affects individual kids and their families and their experience in school and their outcomes in life because of what they received or not as they've gone through their education journey. And so I just think it's really important for people to understand, if this law didn't matter to children, you and I wouldn't be talking about it today.
Right.
We wouldn't want, I mean, there's lots of laws on the books that nobody talks about because they rarely are impacting individual people in a significant way. But the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal law that went into effect in 1975, last reauthorized by Congress in 2004. It is the framework for special education in the United States as we know it. And what I think is important is for people to understand, what was the purpose of the law? What was the intent of Congress? Why did they do this? Prior to 1975, lots of children with disabilities weren't in school. They were not being served by public schools. And it was recognized at the federal level that that was a problem. And how they recognized that it was a problem in particular were parents. Parents were saying, we have children with unique needs that need to be educated. Even with their challenges, they still need an education. And so it was parent advocacy and parent as lobbyists who really helped make sure that we had protections in place and expectations that children with unique needs would also be educated in our public school systems.
And authentic parents. They were real, genuine parents who had a stake in the issue with their own children in the issue, which another future podcast we're going to talk about is beware of these groups that are parent something or other that really aren't parents. What they are is funded by lobbyists or funded by a different industry who has a stake in the game, or some
Or
type of
PACs.
union or PACs or teachers or whatever it is. So you've got to really drill down now because the game's gotten a little more complicated. But originally it was authentic parents who knew that there was a need and rallied the troops and got together and made the people that are in charge of the country and decisions, made them aware of the problem. And this was their effort to correct it.
Right. So the purpose of special education, and I'm going to read this, it comes right from the text of the law, is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education. And that's a word you're going to hear as we talk about it. It's also known as FAPE, free, appropriate public education, that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet the unique needs and prepare them. And here's what's important. Here's what the schools are responsible for doing for children with disabilities. Prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So as much as we want to talk a lot about reading and writing and math, the expectation of what we are doing for our children with disabilities is to prepare them for life after school. So further education, if you don't have reading, writing, and math, that's going to be hard. Employment, and so it's making sure that our kids are exiting school with skills so that they can become good employees, so that they can run their own businesses, so that they can participate in civic life. And then independent living. Can they take care of themselves? Can they meet their daily needs? And if they can't, helping families get connected to the supports and services that will help them when their child becomes an adult. And making those connections so that when they leave the K-12 public school system, they don't fall off a cliff.
Absolutely.
And that is in the law as a responsibility that the school district has, is to make that transition from public school to adult life, um, so that there are connections, so that families aren't left to do that all on their own.
And it was intentionally broad, and it was intentionally a higher bar. So it
Yeah.
wasn't you just have to teach them the state standards and whatever it is you're teaching this year, science or math or social studies. It was if little Johnny wants to be a doctor, what you have to do is prepare little Johnny for post-secondary education, which will enable him to go to medical school to be a doctor. And that is the conversation that needs to be taking place more often and more frequently in some of these meetings, rather than fighting over 15 more minutes of special education time with a special education teacher. It's the conversations are sometimes a little too myopic.
Yep.
So remembering what Susan just read is really important before you enter these meetings.
Absolutely. And the students' interest and their strengths should be driving that conversation.
Mhm.
It should not be what does the school have available. It doesn't matter what the school has available. I mean, that isn't should not be the premise of the conversation. It should be about what is Johnny interested in? What does Johnny want to do when he leaves school? What does Johnny's parents think about that? The parent input is really vital to help guide this conversation. Sometimes what our children desire to do may not be something that anybody at that table thinks they're capable of doing. We see that gap often. And I'm going to take something like really extreme, but we may have a student with a known cognitive disability. We recognize that this person has some cognitive limitations, but yet their desire is to be an astronaut. And so it is the IEP team's responsibility to to figure out what is it about being an astronaut that intrigues that person. Why do they want to be an astronaut? What other options might they have that are reachable that would give them something that is online with what their interest is? And this is a real scenario. There was a student that I worked with years ago, and he was all about space. He loved anything to do with space. He wanted to be an astronaut. And I mean, that's a very select group of people. The amount of people in our country who get to be astronauts is a tiny, tiny number. But when we explored it further, what he really liked was the uniform, the the clothing that astronauts wore, and he thought it was really cool. And he likes space, so those two things went together, and he had been on a field trip with his family to the Space Coast and had gone to the NASA, and so it was just this was his dream. Well, we started talking about things that were more reasonable, and what he really wanted at the end of the day was something to be able to wear a uniform that had his name on it. Um, and And he really if he they did not live close enough. He would have really liked to work at NASA. That would have been, like, the ultimate thing.
Yeah.
But, the family explored some other options in their community, and they found a place, and I honestly, it's been long enough, I don't remember exactly where he landed, but we took the elements of what was important to that person and used it to drive his education plan. And I know that this is not exactly like the nuts and bolts of the law, but it's why the law is important. It is about outcomes for kids.
Mhm.
Um, so we have this federal law, and I want to talk about numbers for a minute. So give me a minute to figure out how to switch our screen. Here we go. And so I think it's important for folks to know how many children this impacts. You might be surprised. Nationally, we have 7.5 million children receiving special education services um, across the country. That's a lot of kids. This is that's why we say this is a broad law that impacts every school in the country has a child with a disability. And when we look at statistics, 1 in 5 people in our country, not just children, but people, are people with disabilities. So everybody, I mean, all of you know somebody that has a disability. You may not know. Sorry.
I'm sorry, when I try to speak it, I'm still getting that feedback. We'll figure that out if you can't hear it. I apologize. But even dyslexia, what's the dyslexia number right now? 1 in 5,
It's
isn't it?
1 in 5.
Right. So
Right.
that's just one piece of a category within one eligibility category of a specific learning disability is 1 in 5 we know.
Right. So for folks that don't know, to get into special education in the United States, your child has to be found eligible under one of 14 categories. And those categories are defined in federal law, but each state can do their own like little bit of twist on it. So what it's called in Florida might be a little different in New Jersey. But the categories themselves are pretty similar across the country. Um, Children with communication disorders, that number is 1 in 10.
Mhm.
The autism number, I mean, that's a kind of a changing number depending on what group reports on it, but it's like 1 in 43 or it depends on what group. But think about that. If we have 30 children in a classroom, because in some school districts that's your number, in every other classroom, you're going to have a student that's autistic.
Which is important to say that everyone needs to understand special education is not a place. It's not an area you go to educate someone. It is a set of services and supports and a plan that is put in place by the IEP team to best educate that child. So when we say these numbers, they are not children that are funneled into a room to be taught together by a special teacher. That should not be happening anywhere.
Well, unless that's what the child needs.
Right,
There's a
right.
continuum of services. That's the words we use in special ed, the continuum of services. And so most children will be what we call the least restrictive environment. They're going to be in a gen ed classroom and supported in some way by either having accommodations so that they can access the curriculum, having special education, direct instruction if for the area where they struggle. It may be that they need to go to a special ed classroom for part of the day because they just need something very specialized that can't be delivered in the gen ed classroom. They could be in special ed in that separate room all day. And some of our most needy students are actually in a special school that's just for students with disabilities. And then we have 2 very, very restrictive environments that I mean, a tiny percentage of students need either hospital homebound, which often is if a student has some sort of health condition that prohibits them from attending school. And then we have some students that have residential placement, and that often is related to significant behavioral help that they need. And so they may be in a residential placement. But I mean, all of those different types of service models fall under special education. So here in Florida, which is where, again, we're in Sarasota County, so we're going to talk a lot about Florida and about our local community. We have almost 600,000 students as of last year receiving special education services. And here locally, we have more than 12,000. So that's a lot of children that have unique needs that the school district is responsible for creating an individualized plan and figuring out how do we serve these children? How do we prepare them for post-secondary education, to employment, and for independent living? And so here locally, let me go back to the federal government. I know I keep switching between topics, but they're all interrelated. And so the federal government gives grants to states in order to help pay for special education. the funding that states receive from the federal government was there was a threshold set when special education was originally written back in 1975. I think it was around 20% was intended that the federal government would give to states. It's never been that high. We have never reached the threshold that originally was intended by the federal government. It varies from year to year what percentage of education is paid through that federal grant. At a future podcast, I can actually pull up the application that Florida submitted for special education to the federal government, and we can look at what did Florida tell them and how much money did that bring into our state. And it's a big grant that comes through. But along with grants are accountability measures. And so the federal government has a series of indicators that they look at, and states and work with the federal government to set targets of what percentage of students should meet these indicators in order for the state to be proficient in what they're administering. And so the state of Florida wrote a strategic plan for the years 2020 through 2025. That's what umbrella we're under right now. And they picked 16 indicators, but on a couple of them, they broke them into smaller parts. So there's more than 16 to look at how are we doing as a state in delivering special education. Any questions yet? Does that make sense, Sue?
I think it makes perfect sense. The only thing I think that you could place in maybe to make people understand that we've got the federal law, but then at the state level, each state makes their own rules that can be a little bit different and more specific, not taking anything away from federal law, but adding to whatever the federal law says as far as how things will be delivered in special education in their state. So we've got the top layer, then we've got the state layer, and now Susan's talking about the money coming from the federal government down to the state making their strategic plan of what they would like to be, for lack of better terms, graded on. The federal government must approve that plan, and then we are going to talk about what the plan says and what the indicators are.
Right. So I'm going to read through them, and just know there's no test at the end of this, folks. You don't have to remember all of this. In future podcasts, we're going to dig a little deeper into some of these indicators and what do the numbers tell us? How are we doing? What needs to change? What do we need to improve? What are we good at?
Because a good strategic plan, you work towards something and you tweak it as you go to make things better. You don't just, not like what last year said, so you redo next year's, or at least that's the way it should happen.
Right. And this was a 5-year plan. And so they had targets under each area that they were heading for and looking at, did we meet the mark that we set for ourselves? And if not, then what do we need to change? So the first two indicators were graduation rate for students with disabilities and the dropout rate. So how many students were dropping out? And then the next set of indicators, indicator 3, they broke into 3 parts, A, B, and C. Sorry, 4 parts, and A, B, C, D. The first A was the number of children participating in standardized assessments that had IEPs. The second indicator was what was the proficiency level of those children that participated in standardized assessments. And they're comparing them to their non-disabled peers. Are kids with special ed services able to do, are we giving them the things to allow them to be proficient like their non-disabled peers? The third indicator is proficiency for children with IEPs who are on alternate standards. So for people that don't understand, if you have a student who has a cognitive disability and they are not able to meet the general education standards, even with supports and services and accommodations, then we modify that standard and we measure how are the children doing on the modified standard.
And the state recently enacted a very strict IQ to determine one of the things that you'd have to be able to qualify for the modified standards on top of other things. But it's not just like a willing, or should not be just a, ooh, we don't think this child's going to do well on the standardized assessment, so we're going to put them in a modified curriculum. That's not at all what was intended by this.
No. In Florida, if you're one of the indicators is you must have an IQ under 67. And
Mhm.
that's the new mark. And
Well,
I guess there's a little bit of wiggle room if there's a really good argument of why somebody who doesn't meet that mark really needs to be on a modified curriculum at an individualized level. The team can look at that, but in general, it's one of the checklists that a team is going to consider as you're looking at a modified curriculum. Another thing to be aware of is the federal government says 1% or less of children in a state should be on modified curriculums. And if you're going to go over that threshold, then you need to have a waiver. And Florida has applied for a waiver every year and been granted a waiver, but it is a target is to get less than 1% of our children on modified curriculums.
and we're talking about the most significant cognitive disabilities, not even a significant cognitive disability, the most significant. And so that's a conversation we'll have in another podcast because we do have some opinions about that.
Correct.
A
But
little experience with that.
indicator wise, I just want to give people enough information to understand why this is a separate group
Right.
that they watch. And then the last indicator in this section is the gap in the proficiency rates.
Oh, interesting.
If again, it's looking if students with disabilities are proficient at this rate, I mean, without disabilities are proficient at this rate, and students with disabilities are significantly less proficient, why is that happening and what do we do to close that gap?
Mhm.
Indicator 4 is broken into 2 categories, and I honestly don't know exactly what the difference is in the 2, but it's all about suspension and expulsion data and looking at over identification of students with disabilities and being suspended and expelled, and also looking at that in individual race and socioeconomic groups. Like, are there certain groups of kids with disabilities who, because of some other factor, or even have being suspended and expelled at higher rates? So that's indicators that we're looking at. Let me there's 16 of these, so I just need to get to the next group. Hang on.
You were at 4.
Yep. Indicator 5 is the educational environments or the least restrictive environment. So are children being educated with their non-disabled peers as often as they possibly can? And so we're looking at rates, how many students, again, that continuum of services we talked about, how many students are being removed from their non-disabled peers? And are we making sure we're not doing that in an arbitrary way? Indicator 6 is about preschool environments. And this is something I know locally we've talked about a long time, is having opportunities for preschool students with disabilities to be in with their non-disabled peers and making sure that there are opportunities for that and supports in place. Indicator 7 is the preschool outcomes for children. Indicator 8 is probably the one I have the most opinion about. It's parent involvement. And I feel like because parents are supposed to be partners in the special education process, the law requires that having parents have an opportunity and enough information and education and understanding to fulfill the role that they're expected to play in special education. Over our many years of doing this, I have seen that this is an area where school districts don't spend enough resources or time, or are not welcoming enough to the parents I know you have some opinions about this too. And again, it's a future podcast. We'll really get into parent involvement, but it's interesting that it's an indicator that we're measuring.
I'm anxious to hear what the scores. When are we going to talk scores?
Scores, we're
Yeah.
getting there. Indicator 9 is about disproportionate representation. And then indicator 10 is disproportionate representation in specific disability categories. So again, historically, when we have looked at states, there have been certain groups of kids by socioeconomic or race that have been over-identified in certain categories of disability, or maybe just as kids with disabilities in general. So if your population of African American students or Asian students or Hispanic students is 10% of your total population, but they're 25% of your kids with disabilities, why is that? Because we know statistically that just because you're a certain race doesn't mean you are more likely to be a person with a disability. And so it's one of the things that the federal government is paying attention to and the state pays attention to make sure that our criteria for figuring out what kids need help is not biased because of the way that we're doing those things. Okay, so that was indicator 9 and 10. Let me get to the last slide. I have notes for myself and I just have to keep switching. So, all right, indicator 11 is child find. So why don't you tell everybody what child find is?
Child find is the school district's responsibility to determine if a child does need special education and do the evaluations to support the necessary information that will help the team determine if they do qualify for a specific for an eligibility in order to access special education and be a part of the population that requires special education supports and services. So what we often see our parents, they will come to us and say, but I've been asking for a long time. I knew little Johnny was struggling in this or that or the other thing. And the child just was given good grades and moved along to the next year where they struggled some more. And it's kind of this vicious circle of promotion. And it was actually the school's responsibility when the parents first identified. The parents didn't even need to identify. The teachers would have seen the children struggling in school. But certainly when a parent identifies the issue and requests assistance from the schools need to take that parent seriously, convene a team, start the process, whatever it might be, or they are what we believe to be in violation of a child find responsibility. So what does this measure? How does this one get measured, Susan?
I don't have all that detail for you today. We're not going to get that deep. But I think child find is a future topic that we really do need to talk about. And
we should bring some parents in.
I'm sorry.
We could bring some parents in for that one and let them tell their stories.
We could, and it's just, I want to make sure that everybody understands that it is the school district's responsibility to identify all the students in their area that their school district serves that might have a disability, whether they're a private school student, whether they're a charter school student, whether they're a homeschool student, whether they're a public school student. Like child find is a very broad responsibility. And if they suspect a student has a disability, then they should evaluate that child. In Florida, part of the evaluation, the first step that they suggest is a multi-tiered system of support, gathering some information and data and seeing, does a child just need some remediation in order to close a gap that might have existed. And if that child responds to that, then they may not move to that next step of evaluation. But and that's a whole podcast and a half probably to talk about what we call MTSS. But once the formal evaluation process starts, the school district has 60 days by law to complete the process. And one of the things the indicators are looking at is, are they completing that process in a timely fashion?
Mm.
Because delay, we know, is harmful to children. If they really need help, we need to get it in place. And so meeting these deadlines that are established within the law are there so that we don't delay identifying a child and getting services started if that's what they require.
So is that this one? Is this how many
Yeah.
children?
Yep.
Got
Indicator 12 is early childhood transition. So that is looking at students who are already identified as kids with disabilities in pre-K, and they're making that leap to kindergarten, having a seamless transition so that services continue and that we have good IEPs in place for these children to start kindergarten. Indicator 13 is secondary transition. That starts in different. Now, here's one of those things where the federal law says 16. In Florida, we've decided that secondary transition starts when the student turns 12 or enters middle school. And so we're looking at what courses, services, supports, linkages to other agencies does a child need to be prepared when they're exiting school so that they can go to post-secondary, so that they can be employed, so that they can do independent living or supported living if that's what they need. So anyway, secondary transition is looking at all of those measures of connecting students and preparing them for adult life. And again, we start looking at that really early in Florida, thankfully. I have to say, here I'm going to opine for a minute, that I think one of the things Florida has been focused on for the 20 years that I've been here and been part of special ed is trying to put transition services in place and making districts aware at how important they are. So the state values transition planning, and they have for a very long time. Do I think that means that we do it well for all kids all the time? Absolutely not. But I think that we're aware of how important it is to do it. There's certainly room for improvement. Okay, so indicator 14 is looking at post-school outcomes. So it's trying to measure what if what we've been doing in secondary transition, did it translate to kids being employed, to kids going off to college, to kids being able to do independent living. So we're measuring that. The last two indicators, 15 is resolution sessions and 16 is mediation. So if your child is receiving special education services and you are unhappy, you don't feel that what the school is delivering is what is in your child's IEP or IEP, individual education plan. It's the individualized plan that we write of how special education services should be delivered to your child. What do they need? Who's going to do it? How often is it going to happen? Where is it going to happen? How are we going to measure it?
It's the document you leave the IEP meeting with, or should, and it's actually the formal contract. So It's very important. Read it, know it, understand it. It's a legal contract.
And follow up on it. It's a living document. It's not something we write once a year and then sit on a shelf. You should be getting reports quarterly of at least quarterly, how is your child doing? Are they making progress? If they're not making progress, you should be coming back to the table and saying, what do we need to do differently or more of, or are you actually doing what it says? But if you're unhappy, like for some reason your child's needs aren't being met, or what the document says isn't what you believe your child needs, and you can't come to an agreement with your school to make changes, then you can file a formal, what they call a due process. You're requesting a hearing before a judge in order to present your case of what you think your child needs, or isn't getting. And before you actually get in front of a hearing officer, there are some other steps that can happen. One of the things that can happen is there's within 15 days of when you file a complaint, a resolution session should be held. And if you agree to do that and the school district agrees, both parties have to agree, but within 15 days or a meeting should be held, and to see if you can work out your differences. Can you resolve whatever the problem is? And so they're measuring of the due process hearings that are filed, how many of them get resolved in a resolution session.
Does it break it down? How many of the due process complaints have people agree?
There is a target and there is a reported number, but I don't have that data in front of me.
Gotcha.
And then the last indicator is mediation. So another thing that can happen is a parent files due process and the school district says, we'd really like to have a mediation session. We'll bring in a mediator. It's paid for by the state. And their job is to try to help facilitate getting to a resolution that everybody can live with. If you get there, both sides can agree, then a formal contract is written up that can be adjudicated. Like you can take it to court if they don't follow through on it. It's a binding agreement. But anyway, they're measuring how many mediation sessions result in a mediation agreement.
Oh, interesting. That's one thing to note is when you do file a due process complaint, what you have to do is indicate what you want your remedy to be. So let's say you realize at the end of the school year, your child was supposed to receive speech and language services for 60 minutes a week. And at the end of the year, for why it takes that long, I don't know. But at the end of the year, you realize that the speech and language pathologist never saw your child. There were no services delivered. If you choose to file a due process complaint, the remedy would be X number of speech and language service hours as compensatory education, potentially. So in that mediation, you could walk away getting what you want without having to go to a hearing.
Absolutely. And, one would hope, and this has not always been our experience, but one would hope if logic is prevailing and goodwill is there and what you're asking for as a parent is reasonable, that you could go and present, look, here's the facts, here's what I'd like to do to resolve it, and you could have a reasonable conversation with the school district rather than having to go fight it out in front of a judge. And it's certainly what the law intends. It is not always the reality. Sometimes we see that parents ask for very reasonable resolutions, and instead of being willing to have those conversations, school districts are like, nope, we'll see you in court. And so that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I am just going to say this. I was shocked when in our district, when we were going through our interview process for attorneys who were going to represent the school district, paid for out of tax dollars. One of the attorneys actually told the school board that. He said, I tell parents all the time, if they don't like what's being delivered in special education, the courthouse is open from 9 to 5, have at it. Like, so that's where we need a podcast about the culture and who our school boards hire and who's actually representing them. And, but yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, the way the law's written is even due process is intended to be a less formal process than a full-blown court hearing, even though there's an administrative law judge that's the finder of fact. There is an expectation that parents can represent themselves to try to get resolution. Now, that's not what we'd ever recommend. if you can find a good attorney and you can afford an attorney, and being represented by counsel in a due process is not a bad idea. But the process is intended that a parent could be pro se and represent themselves. And we have had a couple in Florida that parents have represented themselves and they have prevailed. They have won those hearings. But statistically, you're up against trained attorneys that have taxpayer dollars and taxpayer resources that parents don't have. And again, the balance just isn't there. It's,
And I'm going to throw in a caveat that although we recommend if you do go to due process, it's a legal proceeding. Of course, if you can have an attorney by your side, it's like, what do they say? You can't go to a gunfight with a knife or something like that. But we always recommend interviewing your attorneys, getting references, because different attorneys have various business models, and we're not saying
it's like any other professional you're going to hire. You need to make sure that you check references, that you understand the contract that you're going to sign, that if I give you X amount of money, this is what I'm going to get for my dollars. And so, just buyer beware.
And in Florida, everywhere you could be a pro se person filing a due process request. But in Florida, you can also be a qualified representative. So there are people that are not attorneys that are qualified representatives that also take cases to due process. So there's various ways you can get there. But I think you're saying that these are only pro se. Well, how do we get to pro se?
No. What I said is the parents can represent themselves pro se, but in a due process hearing. I just think it's important to know, if you can't afford an attorney or you can't find an attorney, but you really feel like this is just, I can't resolve this without filing a due process, you can represent yourself. And the law intends for it to be an informal process where parents could just go and tell their child's story and give information and evidence that supports why what they're saying is true. And without getting too deep into this, the hardest part for parents, I think, is the rules of evidence apply. You need to understand the process of how a due process hearing works. You need to know how to get evidence admitted so that the judge looks at it. And the burden of proof that there is a problem falls on the person who files the complaint. So if you, as the parent, file due process against a school district, you have to have the receipts to show what you're saying is true, to prove your point, and be able to present that in a way that somebody who's a neutral party can review everything that you're saying and agree with you that your child isn't getting what they need. And so for some parents, that's an intimidating reach to be able to do that. But sometimes it's necessary. There's no other way to solve the problem.
Right. And what we find is often once the district knows they have to take you seriously and you're not just going to pull your child and homeschool or take some voucher money or go away, when they realize that you are serious about this and you want your child educated in public school, and oftentimes what's happening behind the scenes and what you're unaware of when things are elevated to a district administrator or an attorney, and when the emails start coming back a little bit different, when they start taking you seriously, you can get to a good resolution without fighting. Other times you can't. Other times, think about it. The attorneys are getting paid with billable hours, your tax dollars. So if an attorney's going to make money based on, I think this parent's going to go away, or whatever they're doing in the background that we are not privy to, what's their incentive? Their incentive is not to resolve things with you. their incentive is to tell the school board members, we're going to, this school can't have this be exposed. So here's what we're going to try to do. I mean, some of the things we've seen in behind the scenes stuff is shocking. It's absolutely shocking because these are the people you entrust your children to be educated by. So that's a future episode, but we are gonna start talking some stuff here one of
It
these days.
is. And we feel passionate about this because we have lived it. We have seen shenanigans, as Sue's favorite word, shenanigans. And so here in our local district, okay, so what we just got done talking about was the state strategic plan. All of those 16 indicators and their subparts are what the state of Florida said we're going to focus on. How are we doing over between 2020 and 2025? They started with baseline targets, and then they set targets for each of these indicators, and they were measuring them each year. And in a future podcast, we will dig a little deeper into some of these indicators and how did we do as a state. And then they produce a profile, a report for the state and for each county in Florida every year. And it gives measures of different indicators on their report card. And so in Sarasota, and this is where I'm going to talk on the 30-second version of this story. Back in 2018, Sue and I met a family whose child was not being served appropriately in our local schools. And he had not been for a number of years, even though his family fought to try to get him help. They really didn't understand that what special education services were being delivered and where they were being delivered and how they were being delivered were not appropriate for their child. And they were getting report cards that showed A grades, B grades. And so as a parent,
jump in because this could be many families. I'm curious which family you're talking about. I'm not sure where.
Oh, you know which one, our due process family.
Oh, okay.
And but you're right. This is the common story we get.
I'm like, where's she going with this?
But in this particular student's, we took the family as a client, as an advocacy client, and we set up meetings with the school like we would always set up based on the information the parent had. And a couple of things that were really significant had happened in this particular school year, which made the family realize that they needed some help from people, that they weren't able to help their child navigate through this problem that had occurred in this particular school year. And so we got involved and we looked at the records the parent had, the limited records at the time that the parent had available to them. And we scheduled a meeting and we went to a meeting with the student and we tried to resolve the problem with the school, which is what we always do. We go in, we meet with people, we talk to them, we try to come up with where is this child functioning? What is their present levels of performance? And
but I don't know where you're going with the story, but it took us forever to get that first meeting because it took forever to get the records. We had the records.
Absolutely. But I'm not going to go deep into that. Where I'm going with this is that we did the normal things we would do with any family that came to us to try to help them solve a problem they felt like they were having with their school. We would meet with the team. We would try to get records. We would look at what has the school done for the child? What hasn't the school done for the child? What's the pathway forward? We are where we are. How do we fix whatever's gone wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular instance, after meetings with the school district that went all the way up to the executive level, we could not resolve the problem. It was such a big problem and we didn't even understand all the details of the problem because we couldn't get records. We couldn't get all the records. We couldn't get the truth. That is the point I want to make. Here we were, very seasoned advocates with a long history of working collaboratively in our local school district. And we knew something was wrong, but we couldn't quite figure out
How it happened.
how it happened or why it happened,
Mhm.
or how broad this problem really was.
But there
And
wasn't our interest at that point. I mean,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
Well, I guess I don't, at that point, we never really thought about how broad the problem really
No,
was.
no, but we didn't know. We couldn't
Right.
figure out why we weren't getting the truth.
Right.
We knew we weren't getting all the answers, but we couldn't figure out why.
We didn't realize there was a scandal. We had no
And
idea.
and so this was the first time in all the years we'd been doing this that we were like, we have to consider filing a due process, because after trying to work with the school district, we couldn't even get to what the real problem was.
And we offered very reasonable solutions, and
Absolutely.
extremely reasonable solutions that now I think they would think, what were we thinking? But
Right. And because we didn't really understand all the things that had happened, because still all the records weren't being provided, um, you know, we just didn't have all the information we needed, and the family couldn't get the information they needed to make good decisions.
regardless of the laws in place that tell you
Right.
you should.
And so this is a very long story, but the end of the story is we went to due process. We did have an attorney that we worked with. Um, the family, after many, 7 days of hearings, prevailed on the case. And one of the provisions of what the judge said had to happen was another IEP meeting. And I want parents to understand that when you go to due process, if you win, if you prevail, often one of the things that is ordered is the school district has to meet with you again in order to write an appropriate IEP. And in this instance, when we tried to do that, they still were playing games. They would
So
not write an appropriate IEP. We wound up having to file another due process. We had to go back to court. We won again. And we finally got to a place where we could resolve this for this student. And that was, quite a education for Sue and I, and a long and winding road. But it exposed a number of problems that were happening in our local school district beyond just the student we were working with. And where I'm going with this is, so the school district later hired a company to do a review. It prompted, it was one of the things that prompted the school district to say, we need to look at our special education services, what we're doing here district wide, and we need to understand what's working and what isn't. And so a report was delivered to the school district, and it looked at a lot of the topics of the indicators we just went through that the state measures, this IDEA. Special education, the indicators, a lot of the report that our local district got were the same topics that the indicators are measuring, and about how are services being delivered? Are they working? What is working? What isn't working? What do we need to change? And so in our next podcast, what we would like to talk about is this report, what's happening in Sarasota, what did the people who were hired to look at the special education process here, what did they find? What did they recommend? And then back to Sue's favorite topic, how is our budget aligned to the recommendations that came out of this report? Are we funding the things that we say are important? And do we know?
well, I was going to say, something happened this weekend. You saw a budget,
No, but
but
we,
we have a rough idea. Is that what
yeah,
you're saying? Because
I do.
we do not have the ability to see a budget, no matter, I mean, recently, the past few years, we've not, regardless of attempts, multiple attempts, we've not been able to drill down to really understand that. But I guess we can talk about that Thursday.
Right, right. So I know this was a lot of information. It was longer than we normally talk, but I felt like that for people who want to understand the special education system, then this is sort of the primer. This is the basic information that you need to know in order to understand how the system functions.
Right.
And that the purpose of the system is good outcomes for children. When they exit the public schools, are kids with disabilities prepared for adult life? And all the rest of it is to support getting there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Otherwise, it wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't matter.
Right. Right. And so when we keep our eye on the ball and we always remember this is about the child and everything we do should be about meeting the unique needs of the student and supporting them and their goals and ideas and dreams and outcomes that they desire, then the system works. But when we lose sight of that, then we have all these problems that keep surfacing.
Well, and a lot of noise, a lot of distraction, a lot of drama. And I really think if we could come together and find common ground and do some truth telling, it would be a much better outcome. And especially all these families moving to Sarasota. I just at dinner at a restaurant the other night met another family who moved here and for our A rating. But I think drilling down into some of this information would really tell parents.
So just a preview, a sneak peek, one of the things that's in the report was a recommendation of having a team that would specifically look at students that are transferring here from another place. And
Oh.
are they being served well? Because I know that that's a call we've been getting, particularly the last couple of years, where families that have moved here from another state or another county, that their child's services aren't immediately put in place that are comparable to where they came from, which is what the law expects. And that was one of the things that was identified in the report that was done, is looking at how could they do a better job of getting transfer students served better.
So interesting, especially in light of fact of some of the recent meetings we've been in.
Yeah.
It's all very interesting. Yeah, truth be told, I haven't read this yet. My issue with this was different, but I'm very excited to read this and talk about this.
So it's a 98-page report. It's available on the Sarasota County School District website. If you Google special education report, you can find it. If you're burning to know what is the topic we're talking about. But it was enlightening. I'm sorry?
Or if you're thinking of moving here.
Yeah, if you're thinking of moving here. But it was enlightening. And I also think for people who might be watching this that aren't in Sarasota and you're like, why would we care? I think a lot of the topics that are discussed and the solutions that are presented probably generically will be true in a lot of school districts across the country. And we talk to families from all over in different states, and the topics are pretty similar. How individual schools solve problems is a little different, unique to different places, but the big, broad systemic issues we hear as we talk to colleagues across the country and families across the country are really similar. So again, this report is unique, the recommendations for Sarasota County, but I think that the topics are important for anybody who has a child receiving special education services.
I agree. Well, thank you for all that information, Susan. And how can people look at find them? Is it the DOE website?
The indicators?
The indicators and the reports.
Yep. There's the Florida Department of Education, fldoe.org. has, if you just Google for this ESE strategic plan, you should find the document that has all the indicators and the measures. And if you want to find the Sarasota County report, again, it's the sarasotacountyschools.net website, and you can Google for ESE report. It was done in 2023, and so it's pretty recent. And they're really easy to find. I don't have links because they're PDFs, and so it's harder to link a PDF. But again, anybody who's really interested in this, a Google search will turn it up for you pretty darn quickly.
And otherwise, we're going to talk on Thursday and drill down into it at
Yep.
11-ish.
Yep, 11-ish.
11-ish. Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you. It was good to see you, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And if you have questions, leave them in the comments section, and we'll be happy to try to address them at a future podcast.
Have a great Tuesday.
Thanks.